from ignoring the advice of the coaches in his corner to allowing Kamaru Usman to become his own personal nightmare. Jorge Masvidal reveals the biggest regrets of his UFC career following UFC 287 retirement. Of course, one of the former UFC welterweight fighter's major regrets is not listening to his coaches. I mean, isn't the whole listening to coaches thing combat sports 101? According to Jorge, failing to take the advice of his coaches resulted in a major roadblock to his improvement as a fighter. And now that he's walking away after roughly 20 years in the game, he has a slew of regrets. Well, you know what they say, hindsight's 20/20. The former title challenger came back to the world of MMA at UFC 287 after a year-long hiatus and was set to face Gilbert Burns at the co-main event. The Brazilian submission grappler was dying to get into the ring with Gamebred, but before the fight took place, Jorge said if he lost the bout, he'd walk away from the sport he loves so much for good. Unfortunately for the Miami native, Gilbert Burns was not ready to lose that fight. A bone-chilling battle took place in the first round, but Dorino completely dominated Masvidal in the next 2 rounds. And after a brutal 15-minute contest, the Miami native suffered his 3rd straight loss via decision, after which Jorge stayed true to his word and retired from MMA. But apparently, Jorge has mixed feelings about retirement.
It's been a long 20 years, 50-something fights. You know, sometimes your favorite basketball player ain't got that three-pointer no more. Your favorite quarterback loses that rifle. I don't feel the same when I get in here no more. It's been 20 long years. I love all of you.
And on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani, the former welterweight contender talked about how he paved the way for fighters like himself to come up into the world of MMA. And despite Jorge's many accomplishments, like the fastest knockout in UFC history, for instance, at UFC 239, he still has regrets about his career. In the interview with Ariel, Jorge was asked if he had any regrets. And although he didn't name one specific thing in particular, it's clear that the Cuban-American fighter feels his career is littered with regrets. Jorge wishes he had his present-day wisdom at the time he was messing up during his fights. Don't we all, Jorge? Don't we all? The one thing Masvidal's really sorry about is not taking full accountability for his action. And whatever you think of Jorge, love him or hate him, you've got to give him props for that. For fighters who often have inflated egos, the accountability pill can be hard to swallow. Masvidal admitted there were times when he didn't listen to his trainers and coaches, and that he realized it was a serious roadblock to his improvement. While discussing his retirement with Ariel, Masvidal said there were a million regrets that stick out for him, and even referred to himself as Captain Hindsight. After retiring, he finally realized that what his coaches were saying was right all along. Jorge wishes that he was as wise as he is now when he was competing 4 or 5 years ago, claiming that he's much, much wiser now, and that his ego completely left him. Now that his ego's no more, he can finally admit that the problems he faced throughout his career were his own doing, and that the only person to blame is the one he sees in the mirror.
At playing with the distance, I really jumped down at that distance. So I would rank him dangerous in both the stand-up and the ground, but also at the same time a very fitting style for myself, you know.
He went on to add that he felt he'd opened the door for a lot of fighters like himself to get accustomed to the sport, whether they had an ideal background or not. It's obvious that Gamebred's impact on fighters is something he's really proud of, and that's one of the things that he certainly doesn't regret. Did you know that Jorge never had a traditional collegiate background and got his start by taking part in brutal street fighting? Yep, true story. Sort of like the late Kevin Ferguson, aka Kimbo Slice, who also came from a street fighting background. Despite Jorge's unconventional introduction to fighting and a number of professional MMA losses before he signed with the UFC, he quickly rose among the ranks and became a household name when it came to combat sports. Although to this day, one of his biggest regrets is failing to earn a Submission of the Year award. Jorge says it might sound crazy, but he had a whole game plan mapped out and always wanted to try to snag the award. He added that in his career, there's been a number of things he wanted to do, but didn't get a chance to. He might not have been able to get that one award. However, that doesn't mean he hasn't accomplished a lot in his professional career. I mean, he's world famous for his flashy knockouts, his excellent striking game, and he has 2 submissions in his MMA career. One of those was against Michael Chiesa during UFC on Fox 8. Man, now that was a fight. And since we're on the topic of Jorge's legendary fights, when he was paired up against Ben Askren, he changed the entire game within a thunderous 5 seconds. The longtime welterweight fighter set a UFC record when he defeated Ben with a destructive 5-second knockout with the most epic flying knee. That was something straight out of Mortal Kombat, I swear to God. That knockout was one for the books. Ben tried to shoot for one of his signature takedown techniques, but Jorge was light years ahead of him. Sometimes the animosity between two fighters fades after the fight is over, but that wasn't the case in this bout. Gamebred immediately started taunting and insulting his opponent as he lay on the ground stiff as a board. It was the very definition of savage, and a night I'll never forget. Both fighters trash-talked one another in the lead-up to the fight, and Askren had a habit of running his mouth before fights. But we all know that Jorge doesn't take kindly to insulting remarks from his opponents, and he vented his frustrations after the fight. Ben needed a ton of medical attention following the vicious KO, and it was clearly a devastating loss for him. I'll bet he regrets talking all that smack. Not only was this the first defeat of Ben's career, but it was done in such a brutal and dramatic fashion that everyone quickly began to question his skills in the game. Before the KO, Ben was being considered for a title shot, but there was no way that was on the table after such a humiliating defeat. As for Jorge, the flying knee KO was his second consecutive knockout, and both were totally highlight reel worthy. In his previous fight, Jorge KO'd Darren Till in a brutally vicious style as well. For his efforts against Ben, the Cuban-American fighter earned a Performance of the Night bonus worth $50,000 US. Crazy cash. Not too long after, Jorge squared off against Nate Diaz and became the promotion's first ever BMF champion. Even though his career's trajectory hasn't always been silky smooth, he's definitely earned the respect of the masses with these insane wins. During his fight with Nate Diaz at UFC 244, Jorge dropped and cut his opponent within moments of the bout getting started. Of course, the California-based fighter eventually made his way back up, and we were given 3 rounds of primal mayhem before a doctor stoppage because the cut above Diaz's eye was just too damn nasty. Masvidal was victorious, and he left the octagon with the BMF belt wrapped around his waist. It was incredible. Clearly, Masvidal's enjoyed the sweet taste of success and victory, but he's also sampled the bitter and sour taste of defeat. I think we all remember UFC 261. Jorge was matched up against Kamaru Usman for the second time, and I was on the edge of my seat throughout the thrilling fight. Kamaru was defeated by the Miami scrapper once before, but Jorge took the fight on late notice at the last minute, and doubts still linger on as to whether the outcome of the fight would have been different had Masvidal been given more time to prepare. From the beginning of the bout, the Nigerian Nightmare looked way more prepared for the fight, and in the second round, he landed a right hand that was so powerful it knocked Jorge off his feet within milliseconds, and it was game over. Something I know Jorge regrets to this day. So there you have it, fight fans. From allowing Kamaru Usman to become his own personal nightmare to ignoring the advice of the coaches in his corner, Jorge Masvidal reveals the biggest regrets of his UFC career following UFC 287 retirement.